everybody somewhat of a break this afternoon to proceed with our regularly planned agenda of the interim. And first up this afternoon will be the transition to our monthly ad valorem taxation. As you remember, committee, this has been a topic for as long as I've been in the legislature, but really this past 2 years, we've made strides forward into collecting taxation, primarily up in Campbell County. And then this last session, it moved into an interim topic for the Revenue Committee. So with that, Mr. Noble, would you like to kick us off regarding how it's going so far in the first 3 months? Was that the plan?
Well, we can try. I think Mr. Chairman, Dan Noble again with the Department of Revenue. I guess a lot of this depends on the how the Enrolled Act was actually drafted. I know when this passed out of committee, the Revenue Committee, and went to the Senate floor, it was a substantially different bill than what started the process. And the original bill, the department was going to be administering the monthly payment of this tax. It looked very different. There was going to be sort of a grace period, phase-in period type thing. Senator Case developed a different, I guess I'd call it a different mechanism for the bill. And there was a Senate Standing Committee amendment. It was presented to the Senate. It was adopted. And as everything that I have read from this, it removed the Department of Revenue as it relates to the administration of this transition and moved it to the county treasurers. I reviewed the Enrolled Act, and it has the department back in there as the responsible party for this, and I'm a little concerned about it, mainly because that was not what was in the Standing Committee amendment, and I don't know how it got from the form that was presented to the Senate to the Enrolled Act, and I'm a little concerned about that. So I guess I'd say there's a little bit of a quandary as to how this is going to be administered moving forward. I've certainly listened to any thing that I was not aware of. I did not hear of any changes being made after the Standing Committee amendment that were of substantive nature, and I'm a little concerned that we're a little behind the 8 ball because there's going to be some form changes necessary by the department if we're to do this. So I guess my short answer is I'm not really sure where we're at with this, because this is not the bill that we were reviewing when it came to us in Senate Revenue. I'll certainly entertain any questions if I can, but I'm not really sure what the status is from the department's perspective, because we're a little concerned about this. I've got an inquiry into the LSO to figure out if there was a drafting error, or if there was a conference committee that is not listed on the. I don't see one. It looked as if it was just a concurrence, and that was all that happened. But I'll stand for any questions you may have. I wish I had more to tell you at this point.
All right, thank you, Director Noble. I share your frustration, because sometimes we send really good bills to the Senate and they come back and I have no idea what happens as well. Is it Senator Case or anyone from the Senate remember a change to the administration to the Department of Revenue to oversee this? First time I've heard about it. Seeing no one raise their hands. Or Senator Case?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't completely have the answer. I'm a little surprised we're hearing about this now, I will say that. So I'm not sure if there is a problem or not. Josh, are you online?
I am here, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Look into this with respect to that aspect of the Department of Revenue's participation. Do you have time to look it up on the website while we continue our conversation?
Yeah, if Director Noble could send it to me, I'd be happy to see if I can try to track this down. This is the first time hearing of it as well. I will say, just briefly looking at the Enrolled Act here, that the department is not, that I see, just in a real quick review, involved in the transition period. Once they're fully transitioned, I think the department plays a role, and I'm not sure if that was the issue or not. But anyway, if he could send me an email or something with his issue, I'd be happy to try to track that down while we're going here.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could,
Senator Case.
so we have to figure this out, what the bill actually says.
Speak loud.
We have to figure out if it's workable, because we do have a couple of special sessions coming up, and we could probably make it more workable if we needed to. I think the important thing is that we really need to get people thinking about this transition. So maybe we could find out what other people are thinking. I know there's some mineral interests and there's some county interests on the board and in the room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Riemann from the County Commissioners Association, welcome. We have county officials up on the agenda first to testify on the topic, but I thought maybe you and your organization wanted to have some opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann. I'm here on behalf of Wyoming's County Commissioners. This afternoon, I'm joined by two commissioners. First, Bill Novotny from Johnson County, who is the WCCA treasurer, as well as Rusty Bell, Campbell County Commissioner and chair of our, or co-chair of our revenue committee here at the association. I'm kind of interested in the conversation that just happened there. I too was a little intrigued when I went in to look at the enrolled bill this morning and saw the department there. I had understood it to transition everything to the county when the Senate bill passed. So it's certainly something we'd want to get some clarity around as we work with the county treasurers and assessors on this particular issue. And of course, working with our friends in industry who are ultimately going to be integral in the transition. Mr. Chairman, in terms of remarks, because this is not a topic that came before the Revenue Committee last year and even during the session until we got to the Senate side, I thought I might just provide a little bit of background data that I did to the Senate so that everybody understands some of the numbers that are really driving our work on this. But I don't want to belabor it. I don't want to focus a lot of attention there because I think there's some important work that we need to do in the days ahead. So I'll be brief with that. So at the request of the Legislative Service Office and Management Council and others that were working on this particular topic, we began to collect data relative to the number of delinquencies, the number of tax accounts that were delinquent, as well as how much delinquency there had been for the period starting with tax year 2009. And for context, tax years typically follow the calendar year, not a fiscal year. And we ran that through the second quarter of 2019. We did that because those bills became due in December of 2019. We just had another period. May 10th was the date for the most recent payment. I don't have that data, but I will collect it and I will bring it back to everybody so that you have it. But some important highlights from that data. During that 10-year period, there was $130.5 million in delinquent mineral ad valorem taxes across the state. There were only 3 counties who had no delinquent accounts. Those are Goshen, Platte, and Teton counties, as you could imagine. And there were 11 counts with more than $1 million in delinquencies, 7 with more than $5 million in delinquencies. And of course, there are some large ones. Campbell County, Johnson County, and Lincoln County are at the top of that list. For some context in terms of that $130.5 million, In tax year 18, there was $39 million in delinquencies, or about 7% of the total mineral ad valorem for that tax year. If you come forward just to that first and second quarters of 2019, there was $33 million in delinquencies, or about 10% of all mineral ad valorem. Typically, there's about $600 million in a given year in mineral ad valorem collected. And I'll provide some more specifics on that as we collect the upcoming data. Mr. Chairman, I did want to go back, passing on from the data and really thank the legislature for moving forward with House Bill 159 and getting that bill across the finish line. It represents a significant step forward in ad valorem taxation collections. It really will put us on a monthly schedule once we get out a few years. But there is still more work that needs to be done. And although it transfers ad valorem to a monthly system, it still doesn't address the full 18-month lag that can exist in the collections of this. So we might in 1 month find out that a company is delinquent and be able to catch that and stop it sooner. There still could be considerable amounts of money that are at risk, if you will, in this conversation. So there's much work that needs to be done moving forward from that 2027 date out to a full transition of the ad valorem system. This topic is really important for a lot of perspectives. Of course, we could talk about, and the commissioners can go on at length about the impacts that this could represent to governmental county operations and the special districts that reside in your communities. But probably perhaps more important in the context of the conversation today is that this represents about 75%, or 75% of it represents local school district money that is not collected. And you heard the impacts this morning that the revenue projections are having on our school funding system across the state. You also have to take into consideration, and I don't think these things are in the current CREG reports, that we are dealing with a couple of recapture school districts in this conversation and what impact that might have. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we would certainly continue to urge work. We will work collaboratively with you, with our partners in industry, to continue to devise a solution as we move this forward towards a full transition. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be able to provide some time for both Commissioners Novotny and Bell to provide some comments as well.
Okay. Anyone from the committee have any questions for Mr. Riemann up front? Seeing none currently, let's turn it over to Mr. Novotny from the County Commissioners Association. Welcome, Commissioner Novotny.
Thank you, Co-Chairman. Can you hear me? All right, members of the committee, thank you. Bill Novotny, Chairman of the Johnson County Board of Commissioners. I'm joined today with our civil deputy who is responsible for most of the property tax protests that involve any of the energy companies that operate in Johnson County, Mr. Barry Craigo. And so we're trying to maintain social distancing while also sharing a screen because we are fiscally conservative here and only have one computer. To put this into context for the committee, we worked tirelessly over the last year with the Select Special Committee on Mineral Bankruptcy to draft the legislation that was signed into law. This is not certainly what we initially envisioned being signed into law by the governor, but it is a good first step. There is impetus in the bill to continue on the discussion, which I hope we can continue. For those of you who are not aware, Johnson County has owed more than $20 million in unpaid ad valorem taxes. On May 11th of this year, the second half of property tax payments would be due to my county treasurer and all the county treasurers across the state. But without the payment from energy companies in the Powder River Basin, my tax delinquency rate is going to increase substantially since that number, and I can have a concrete number of just exactly how dire those outstanding bills are with the conclusion of this month. Since entering Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the fall of 2019, the parent company of the two largest taxpayers in my county, which represents about 10% of my county's valuation, sold more than $30 million in natural gas. Yet during that time, they remitted zero in ad valorem payments to Johnson County. Each day, their employees travel on my county roads, and our county emergency services stand ready to support the activities and any emergency that may happen out in the gas field. Yet they contribute financially nothing to enable us to continue to provide all of those critical services. We could get into the highs and lows of this, where the bill is, but it's just critical that we fix the technical issues in the bill and also advance this issue. There will never be a perfect time to transition to monthly ad valorem, and certainly we did not envision COVID when we began the process of moving us there. This is something that the committee should have followed Representative Madden's example several years ago, and we would have already been transitioned. But it is critical for my county and any county that has mineral production across the state that we continue advancing this legislation and provide the technical corrections that need to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you. Any questions for Commissioner Novotny? Representative Connolly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner Novotny. I'm curious, do you have a list of those technical corrections? And I've got one that I am curious about, but do you have a list for us?
Mr. Novotny?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I believe Jeremiah has worked out some, and also Carol Severs, excuse me, who is the counsel to Campbell County, has also worked up some, and I believe they will be presenting those maybe here in a second.
A follow-up, Representative Connolly?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm just curious, because I'm not sure it's considered a technical correction, but I served on that called bankruptcy committee, and honestly, the bill changed significantly from the time that we were on that committee to what made it through. I mean, which is fine. That's the process. But one of the things that happened towards the end, and I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it was called subsection J. There was an addition that allowed for a county to have negotiations with a company that was going bankrupt in terms of the percentage of taxes that would be owed, without any kind of input from the state, even though our recognition is that a significant percentage of the taxes owed would have been remitted to the state for school foundation. And so I'm curious if that's on your list of things for us to talk about.
Commissioner Novotny, is that on your list today?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, it's actually not. And what you're referencing is what we refer to as the safety valve. It was that emergency procedure. And what you need to, excuse me, understand is those exact negotiations that were codified into law are already happening. And Mr. Craigo can elaborate further on what happens when a taxpayer enters into delinquency and the things that they work out through the treasurer's office and the county attorney's office specifically to negotiate those tax payments. So that is not necessarily on our list of corrections, but we do think that was a critical addition to the bill for counties. And Mr. Craigo, any other thoughts on those negotiations?
Mr. Craigo, if you have any.
Mr.
Good.
Chairman.
Yep.
All I would add is that the way the system's set up now, we currently conduct those negotiations through the county attorney's office anyways. So that really doesn't change the system. If we're negotiating an ad valorem payment schedule, we do it on behalf of the school money or the special district money or all the other entities that the county treasurer actually collects money for. And so that I'm with Commissioner Novotny. We really weren't worried about that provision because it does not change what we're doing now. But I understand the concern, and it's one of the things we talked about when we were at several of your select committee meetings was that dynamic where we as the county actually collect more money for the state or in other entities than we do for ourselves by far. So I appreciate the question.
And then Director Reeman, if you want to jump in, and then I think Senator Ellis will have another question after that. But Director Reeman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to respond to Representative Connolly's question about amendments. Just to be clear, there are a couple of different bills that moved through this last year. Of course, there was House Bill 159, which deals with the monthly payment of ad valorem. The other bill that's actually going to come up in the Mineral Committee next week is relative to the lien bankruptcy issue. And we do have some technical corrections to that bill in particular based on House amendments at the very end of the session. So we'll be bringing those forward to the Minerals Committee next week. In terms of this bill, I don't have technical corrections. What we're asking for is that we continue the transition beyond what is currently contemplated in the bill. I certainly think that was part of the conversation, the agreement that this committee would take that part of the discussion up this year, and that's what we're interested in.
And Mr. Reeman, is it, I guess, too early to tell right now with the impacts from COVID on exactly how that conversation should go, or do we have some concrete points that we can move on or get further drafted at this meeting? What's your sense of, is it a wait and see for a bit longer to see how everything plays out with prices, or are there things we can be doing, at least drafting now?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm of the mind that we kind of have to set aside the price issue, in this conversation, because when we have prices go up, or down, do we slow down and not do this? The reality is we need to go to a full transition, a monthly payment, which this starts that process. And in relationship to COVID, really all that has prevented is our ability to sit down with our counterparts and try and devise out what that might look like and come to you. That was certainly my vision and what I've discussed with the other associations across the state. And so I would love to say I have that for you today. Unfortunately, I don't, because I think we need to get around the table and put our minds to work to make this happen and bring that solution to you.
Thanks. Commissioner Bell from Campbell County, do you have some on the ground things happening in your community of how this is progressing?
Sure. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Great. Yes. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank the committee for listening today. I guess that a couple things that just to add to what we were saying, I guess one of the reasons I want to go back to what Director Noble said, and I guess I was a little surprised too, after all the COVID and getting everybody back to work, and we're finally in Campbell County putting in a new computer system since first one since 1990. So going to our tech people and the treasurer, working on how we're going to get our tax notices out on the new bill that was passed, because the first payment is due in October. We started looking through this, and this is actually right now the language is, Director Noble pointed out, is on them, and it's really not on us. And I don't think that's the way we understood it was going to be. And so I'm going to have a meeting with our treasurer and county attorney and our tech people next week. But I think we need to, that's probably the first on the list, to make sure that the legislation that was actually passed is actually the legislation that we thought it was. That's the first thing. And if not, then maybe we do need to change that up a little bit in the interim. And the reason I say that is because it is a little bit complex. It gets a little tricky because 25% of the tax is paid in October, and then 25 in November of this year. Then in April of next year, it goes to 16.66. In May, it goes to 16.67. And then in September of next year, For 3 more months, it goes 16.66, 16.66, then 16.67. And then it goes to 12.5 for a few months, and then it goes to 10, and then it goes to 8. So there is some transition that has to take place by the tech people that are going to be issuing the tax payment notices. And I think that that's really important for them to get on the same page, and then for us to be issuing these tax payment notices, which I really did believe this was going to be on the counties. And come to find out, the language actually says it's the Department of Revenue. So I think that's really important, no matter which one it is. Certainly Campbell County would love to work with the Department of Revenue to make that work out. And then we can, if we need to be a model for all the other counties on how that works, certainly we would want to do that. And I don't have any problem adding Director Noble and the Department of Revenue to our meeting schedule next week. If we can do that, that would be really good. And in the meantime, maybe LSO can iron out what's going to happen, because it is going to be on us very quickly to have these first tax notices out. And then just one other thing I wanted to add from the earlier conversation was Representative Connolly asked about the Amendment J, which I don't think is Amendment J anymore, but it was basically the deals that counties could basically cut with if this tax payment system didn't work for a certain industry or business, that they could come to the commissioners. I don't believe they have to be in delinquency to make a deal with the commissioners, and maybe we should check that also. I don't know that that's something I would want to change, because we already are making deals. I don't know that we make deals with anybody now until they're delinquent, but we might want to double check that language on this in this bill to see if that's what the language says, or if it means we can actually cut a deal before they're delinquent. So that would be, Mr. Chairman, the couple things that I would put out there that Campbell County can help with. I would just echo the comments of Commissioner Novotny and Mr. Ryman that we'd like to see this transition period go out to whatever it is. I think the spreadsheet I saw in February was out to 2033, where we actually get to a system where we're paying just like we would severance tax to the state. I think that the numbers of uncollected ad valorem taxes compared to uncollected severance taxes are way different, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons why. So anyway, I would stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Bell, Commissioner Bell? Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Bell, I was just wondering, when you're making, you're having negotiations with the delinquent companies, are you talking about when that delinquency happens, or how much? Thank you.
Commissioner Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Roscoe. So right now, I don't believe counties can enter into a negotiation on payments for delinquent taxes until they're delinquent. I don't think we can do that. But I just want to make sure that this bill says what you guys want it to say. Once they're delinquent, once somebody's delinquent, I believe, which we already are in negotiation, we already have deals struck with NTEC and ESM. And so far, so good on those. But I don't know if this bill says you can enter into an agreement prior to somebody going delinquent. I think that's what we want to make sure that it says what we want it, what you want it to say. And I think the way I understand that amendment, it was coming from the Southwest and the coal companies that we heard from in Uintah County or in Lincoln County, apologize. And they had already struck a deal with Lincoln County and prior to their delinquency, I believe. And I think that that's a good idea. At least, I think that has some merit. Certainly if a business has a plan that would work better for them, that sees them paying their full amount of tax over a period of time, as long as it's not 20 and 50 years, something that doesn't make sense. I think that's fair. So I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on that. I don't know if that answers Representative Roscoe's question.
President Roscoe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Bell, I guess I'm sorry that I don't know the answer to this one, but when you're negotiating, are you allowed to negotiate the actual tax burden, the tax price that is due, or is it just a timing issue?
Commissioner Bell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, I get it now. So the only time that we've ever negotiated, from my understanding, the amount due was through bankruptcy, is when that happened in bankruptcy. And then that was negotiated through the bankruptcy courts. The only other time that we've done any negotiating, as far as, it's always been on the length of time and the amount of the payment, but it's always been, the only thing that's been forgiven is the interest, as long as they pay, as long as they stay up to date, the interest has been waived. We've never negotiated for less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case, question? Or Mr. Riemann, further?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just provide a little bit of clarity here in terms of what the options are for counties. A county is unable to negotiate the tax rate or any of those other various provisions unless a company has actually gone delinquent. And then you have that ability. In terms of the Amendment J that was offered in the bill, that only allows the county to enter into a negotiation with a company to maintain the current schedule for payment of mineral ad valorem rather than transitioning into the monthly system. I do not believe that that amendment provides any flexibility for the county to negotiate what the rate is with those particular companies. The rate remains the same. They would just stay on the regular schedule that exists today. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear in the conversation here. The only time that the county can go into any sort of conversation about rates and such is if a company has actually gone delinquent.
Senator Case?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe that's my understanding as well. The Section J came to the Senate. It may not have been J at that time, but it was important to the House, and we left it in. It seemed to make a lot of sense. The counties were thought it was very important, and of course, we did have a major coal producer in the western side of the state that wanted to, was very adamant that it ought to be in. So that's kind of the track record there. I think Mr. Riemann has said it precisely. With regards to the other problem, the elephant in the room about who's in charge, whether the notices come from the Department of Revenue or whether they come from the counties, I'm certainly sensitive to the fact that we need to figure this out fast. I'm wondering if indeed Mr. Noble's office can participate with the county treasurers next week. And then I wonder if there is a solution, and we haven't heard back from Josh yet, I'm sure he's digging into it, but let's say that there is definitely a problem. If there is a way that the Department of Revenue and the treasurers can kind of jointly issue these notices to get us by this period until we can fix it in law. And if there's a possible way to do that with us thinking out of the box here.
Okay. Any further questions for the commissioners or the Commissioners Association? Senator Case? Nope. Seeing none at this time, Representative Sweeney, question, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to make sure I understood Commissioner Novotny's. I sense the level of frustration and understand that, but were you also trying to explain that we might look at moving the target dates closer in as far as this transition period. I was kind of sensing that, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. If that makes sense, Commissioner Novotny. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Mr.
Novotny?
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, what needs to be perfected in the bill, as Commissioner Bell indicated, is that beyond 2027, the way that the final draft that was negotiated in the Senate, it envisioned a much longer payout time. Unfortunately, that's what was not written into the bill. So unless action is taken by the legislature to finalize that transition period, once we get to that 2027, we will not be fully moved into a monthly payment. And the monthly payment is, as Commissioner Bell indicated in those percentages, that how things are paid out over time to slowly catch up. And then there is what's called the true up after each year in the event that a company has overpaid or underpaid in relation to what is actually owed. So no, in no way did I want to construe that we want to slow this process down or push dates out. What we need to do is find the drafting mistakes, get those cleaned up, and then the committee needs to contemplate on how to move to the full transition, which is beyond 2027 out, whether it's 2030 or 2033.
Representative Sweeney, good? Okay. Further questions to the commissioners? Seeing none, I saw Mr. Obermueller in the meeting. Remarks from the Petroleum Association, Mr. Obermueller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pete Obermueller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. So, Mr. Chairman, my understanding was that the purpose of this meeting was to talk about the technical changes and this transition to monthly payments of ad valorem. So I was disappointed to hear a rehash of numbers about delinquency, and it forces me to respond to it. And Mr. Chairman, again, I'm just troubled by that list of delinquencies over 10 years for a number of reasons, but I'll mention two of them. Number one, what those numbers fail to talk about is the total number of ad valorem paid during that time versus what was delinquent. And I didn't, not anticipating this discussion, I didn't update it for 2019. So I have on the most recent data up to half of 2019. And the answer, Mr. Chairman, is that total oil and gas ad valorem during that time totaled over $5.9 billion. And the delinquencies, even if you count all of the delinquent numbers as unpaid, which also is not accurate, that represents a delinquency rate of 1.14%. Now, there has been no similar study on any other tax-paying entity in Wyoming. So we cannot make a comparative analysis about whether a 1.14% delinquency rate is bad, good, or about the same as any other taxpayer. We simply don't know. I merely suggest to you that that particular number, 1.14%, is pretty low. And what we've done with this bill is introduced new risk, new taxes, and reduced our competitiveness for the 98.9% of taxpayers that pay on time and have followed the law. Furthermore, as I think everyone knows, delinquency doesn't necessarily mean unpaid. In fact, the company in the southwest of Wyoming that was brought up before, the reason for the subsection J part was because that company was already negotiating a different tax structure with Lincoln County after they were delinquent. So I don't know because I'm not privy to the analysis, but assumedly that company's delinquent taxes are part of the total delinquency amount, and yet every dollar of that was paid. And it is planned to be paid. I see Jeremiah shaking his head, but they've worked out that deal. The point is that delinquency isn't necessarily unpaid. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, let me just transition to a couple of things regarding the technical corrections. Number one, what was worked out, I suggest to you that actually there is no, that the bill is in fact what the legislature intended to pass. What we worked out in that bill is that what we removed was the very complicated House version that had the department collect and then remit to the treasurer, and then the treasurer would store in an interest-bearing account, and then the treasurer would send it out to the counties via application based on a complicated process with the interest and all that. We got rid of all of that. What we kept was that the department would still collect on behalf of the counties and distribute under the normal course of business. And I recall this is, the session ended about 100 years ago, it feels like. So I understand that it's very difficult to remember how it all worked, but Section 4 of the engrossed bill includes an appropriation for the Department of Revenue precisely for that reason. And part of the reason why that was in there was because for companies now being tasked to submit monthly, this is many filings that used to happen on an annual or biannual basis, now happening monthly. And a company is having to do that in multiple counties for multiple filings on a monthly basis is onerous. So we submit to the Department of Revenue in the normal course of business. They distribute it back out to the counties, and we got rid of all the other treasury and all that stuff, treasurer's office and all that stuff. So, Mr. Chairman, that correction I don't think needs a correction. Finally, Mr. Chairman, on the full transition, recall that the reason why we go from, as Commissioner Bell pointed out, we go from 50 to 12 and a half or 16.66 and then 12 and a half and all that stuff was a slow walk back so that we get from paying biannually to paying monthly. And then we dial back those payments 1 month at a time until we are paying monthly beginning 2 months after the year of production. So that means that companies will begin paying a full 10 months prior to when they are currently required to pay. It is actually an enormous shift. And the reason why, Mr. Chairman, the legislature stopped in 2027 and kept that monthly payment, it is monthly payments then, you're paying every single month. The reason why we stopped there is because that runs up against the wall that had us all in a bind during the session about how do we make the final switch because of when valuations happen and when all of that happens. At that point, legislators at that time will have to make a decision about what to do, because you either have to at that point provide a tax holiday or you have to double tax or some combination of the two. But you can avoid that up until 2027 with just 4 monthly double payments on behalf of the counties. So on behalf of the companies, I'm sorry. So that was the purpose. So Commissioner Novotny is correct in the sense that the counties were interested in essentially a 16-month acceleration, and what the bill does is an 8-month acceleration. Mr. Chairman, I would argue that the trigger put in there in 2027 is appropriate. Be happy to take questions, Mr. Chairman.
So questions for Mr. Obermueller and members of the committee. We did some AV things here in Cheyenne. So if you do have a question, please click that blue hand button because I won't be able to see you as easily if you just wave to the camera. So if anyone has a question for the Petroleum Association, please hit that raised hand button. Seeing none at this time. Further comments from the committee? Seeing none, we'll take any public comment if there is any. And I heard somebody.
That's your co-chairman.
Senator Case.
You better tell folks how to find the blue hand because sometimes it's in different places.
So if you click on, shoot, I think it's part. We went over this extensively in the House. And I know if you have co-host access, Senator Case, you don't get the blue hand like everyone else does. But I think it's
for participants.
In participants. All right. And then we do have some public comment here in Cheyenne. So give me just a second to load those up. And I think the Mining Association should be coming on board momentarily.
He did what Grandma told me not to do. I looked up.
Let me mute Jim. If you'd give me just a second, Mr. Chairman, let me go double check why public comment is not starting. Give me about 30 seconds.
1,000, roll 1,000.
No worries, I can do a song, I can tap dance.
Things in the center.
Hey, anyway, I'm glad to see everybody today. And thanks for all you that came to Lander. How do you guys like Driscoll's background?
It's no better.
So that's paid for by the Wind River Visitors Council.
How do you like Blackburn's background?
I like it.
Where is that? That looks like the Snowy Range.
It's right behind me.
I didn't know Cheyenne was so bumpy. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Case. The issue is I can't get the video started, but I believe Mr. Detai, can you hear us? He can hear us. They didn't set up a mouse along with the computer, so you can't remotely sign in, but I'll get LSO Tech up here to get that to start working here. So while I'm awaiting that, are there other questions regarding the topic for the Commissioners, Petroleum Association? And I don't know, Katie, if you're on, can you start a video automatically for ZZ public comment? There it goes. Thank you. Mr. Detai, can you hear us now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Can. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Travis Detai with the Mining Association, and I swear there's a sign here that says, please refrain from touching the computer, and I touched nothing. So it was not my fault. I appreciate the opportunity to offer a couple of comments here, and first of all, would just kind of tail on to what my colleague with the Petroleum Association said. Not interested in rehashing what we've talked about for the last 4 or 5 years. But what I would add for the discussion is the simple fact that we are going down this road with the first split payment, if you will, the first payment for production year 2019 happening this fall. And what we, from the industry side of things, what we are looking for right now is some direction and some guidance from the counties. If we're going to go down this road, which we are, and we are going to make the transition, I think it is imperative to keep those lines of communications open and to really start working together to make this happen. And that starts with getting those notices out. And I was pleased to hear Commissioner Bell say that's already in the works. It is going to be a tough time. It is going to have, we do have companies that are going to have a tough time doing this. So in order to facilitate the transition, communication is key. I would say that I have been approached by a couple of companies that have asked to broach the subject of delay. I don't think that's possible right now. We are going to do it, and we just need direction on where we're going.
Questions for Mr. Detai? Seeing none at this time.
That was easy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We try. Any public comment in Lander, Senator Case?
I think our county assessor loves it, actually.
Any further public comment in Cheyenne? Not seeing anyone here. Committee, any follow-up thoughts or direction they'd like the county commissioners to go or changes? We're going to work on the issue on the legislation draft and make sure the department and the counties are on the same page moving forward and having LSO check on that. But seeing no further discussion on the topic at this time, I trust you. Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to know more about the meeting that's happening next week and how we can get everybody together to kind of work through this. I think I understood there was a meeting of the treasurers next week, and I don't think we have any treasurers on the call.
I do not see any.
I'm really anxious to get everybody on the same page on this, and the sooner the better. So if there's some miscues and misdirections, let's get to the bottom of them, please. Need a commitment from all parties on this.
Agreed. And I'm sure the County Commissioners Association and other interested parties are committed to working through this as we continue to work out the bumps. I mean, it's, yeah, been a 10-year process. Laws changed twice. Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, I will make myself available for a meeting next week with the commissioners, treasurers, anybody that wants to meet to discuss this issue. I mean, it's important to get it worked out. I've done what I can to kind of trace through what happened with the legislation. There is a $500,000 appropriation in that bill, but it does not pertain to this particular bill. It is associated with other issues that had to be dealt with.
Representative Sweeney, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So obviously there's different opinions between the Petroleum Association and the county commissioners. The recollection of the Petroleum Association is quite different on how we ended up at the legislation. And so I can appreciate having all the parties at the table. I don't know if Mr. Obermuller would be available or willing to participate in this meeting and put his recollections in. If we remember, the director of the County Commissioners Association had an unfortunate accident during this time period and was relying on some of his commissioners who were doing a terrific job in his absence and keeping him up to speed. So I just am curious in listening to all the testimony and seeing Mr. Noble's reactions on camera during some of the testimony. His recollections are different also. So I just throw that out there. I don't know, if it's appropriate that Mr. Obermuller be part of that also in the Petroleum Association and possibly the Mining Association, but they seem to be fine with everything.
Thank you for that, Representative Sweeney. The Mining Association smiled alongside that comment. So with that, any further, I know Mr. Obermuller, you were mentioned, and Mr. Riemann, I'm confident that over the next couple of months, we'll continue to evolve and make sure, as we have been, that things are progressing. And I know nobody's 100%, on their side and the way they see it, but hopefully if we all keep agreeing on the 80% as we move forward, that's the important thing, and ensure everything's working, because we have enough other problems for the next couple of years in Wyoming to get through this that we need all hands on deck. So with that, and seeing no further comments or questions from anyone on this topic, we're going to move on to the Public Service Commission. But committee, if we could take a 10-minute break. Representative or Mr. Obermuller, some comments before we close up this portion of the agenda?
Mr. Chairman, maybe not, but I just, the internet didn't appreciate my tone and so it kicks me off. So I wanted to just check in if I missed a question or something.
I don't think you missed a question necessarily, but Representative Sweeney offered some encouragement for the Petroleum Association, the Mining Association, the County Commissioners to continue to come to the table and work together. We mentioned there's a treasurers meeting next week and weren't sure if Petroleum Association was involved with that, but I'm sure if you're not after the fact, they'll certainly be getting a hold of you. So you didn't miss too much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Yep. With that, committee, let's take a 10-minute break before we get to the Public Service Commission. They are actually here in person, social distancing appropriately throughout the room with me, and I need to do some AV things to get them set up. So let's take a break till about 2:45. If you'd remember to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras, we'll see you back in about 8 minutes. Sides two. So with that, next up on our agenda is the Wyoming Public Service Commission. Testifying live in person here at the Wyoming State Capitol. And we have the chairwoman of the commission, Kara Brighton Fornstrom, who I'm trying to unmute currently. I think Katie's about to unmute and have a slideshow that we'll present to the committee. There we go. And then and Katie, if you could also unmute the public comment for Commissioner Fornstrom.
Mr. Chairman, I can't unmute that computer.
Oh, let me try it.
Okay.
Unmute audio.
And I'm struggling with the screen share, so it'll be just a minute.
Okay.
Check, no check.
All right, Kara, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Excellent. We can hear you. Give us just a second for the screen share, and as soon as that's going. All right, Commissioner Fornstrom. Well, I thought we had it. You had it for a second, Katie. Well, if you have opening remarks, Commissioner, and then we'll get the slides up as quick as we can here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, my name is Kara Fornstrom. I'm the chairman of the Public Service Commission. With me today in the room, I have fellow Commissioner Mike Robinson, also our Commission Administrator, Marcy Norby, our Chief Counsel, Chris Petrie, and also the Administrator of the Office of Consumer Advocate, Bryce Freeman, is with us as well. That's about all I have for introduction. Oh, good. Here we go. So if we can go to the next slide. Slide 2. Thank you. Today, we're here to talk about a couple of topics. One, our assessment rates. To go through that, we're going to give you some good background on the PSC OCA funding, our caseload, some historical analysis about our budget, utility revenues, and ratepayer costs, and then provide you with some information we've compiled on projections on the trend, basically about utility revenues, what our funding forecasts are, and what those ratepayer impacts will be. This analysis will show you that given recent and expected continuing declining utility revenues, that the current assessment rate in the statute of 3 mills is going to be inadequate to maintain existing operations. We're going to go through that. I'll ask for questions following that because the second part of our presentation is really a separate one, which is just about emerging issues. And we'll tackle those first by sector and then talk about several rulemakings that we have going on at the commission right now. Slide 3. I'd like to start with some background for those of you who may not be intimately familiar with the Public Service Commission or the Office of Consumer Advocate. Our org charts are there on your screen. You can see on the left-hand side is the PSC org chart. We have 32 positions. There are 3 commissioners appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. We have 6-year staggered terms. We did complete a reorganization in 2018 to increase our efficiencies and match our workload with new aspects. For example, the business operations unit has been created to really work on our electronic documents, upgrade to the hearing room to increase our transparency and accessibility by the public. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the org chart for the OCA. They have 6 positions with their director being appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. Next slide. This slide just shows you a comparison to our other states in the West of number of employees of the Public Service Commission and the OCA versus the number of utilities we regulate. And then it works into a ratio of utilities per Public Service Commission employee. As with all things that we do, it is somewhat difficult to get an apples to apples comparison of how to look at this because every commission has different types of jurisdiction and different duties that they have. But you'll see here that the Wyoming PSC averages 9.72 utilities per employee, which is the highest you'll see across the West. Also for the OCA, you'll see that they have the minimum number of staff, and they really do function quite differently than a lot of OCAs in the West. Utah, for example, those 8.5 positions really work to manage expert witnesses contracts. They don't actually do a lot of testifying on their own. That's very different than the Wyoming OCA, who has in-house subject matter experts who testify in front of the commission on a regular basis. Next slide. The basics of our funding are on this slide. We have a uniform assessment that's in statute 37.2.107. That assessment funds both the PSC and the OCA. The PSC also has a separate budget for the Wyoming Universal Service Fund, but that has a separate statutory assessment. The assessment started in 1967 with a 2.5 mil limit, which was raised to 3 mils in 1973 and has not been changed since then. The one exception to the uniform assessment of utilities is in 37.2.108, and it exempts utilities have less than $5,000 of gross intrastate retail revenue from being assessed. The statute does limit the assessment rate to 1 year, and as I mentioned, limits the levy to 3 mils of gross Wyoming intrastate retail revenues. The formula there is the next bullet point on what the maximum of our funding can be. But what happens is we look at our budget and we look at revenues and we do that ratio to see what the assessment needs to be for the next year. In fiscal year 2019, our assessment was 2.9653. So we got very close this year, but that has happened before. That hasn't been something that's been gradually occurring. The closest we ever got to that 3 mil limit was actually in fiscal year 2009, which was 2.9991. 2018, we were at 2.86, and in fiscal year 97, 2.883. The mechanics of the assessment are in that last bullet point. The Department of Revenue assesses all the public utilities in August. So what happens is we get annual reports from utilities in April for the year prior. Those numbers are then calculated and we work with the Department of Revenue to determine what the assessments will be. The first half of that assessment is due on October 1st, and the second half is due on April 1st of the next year. So for example, we paid, the assessments we're getting this year are for 2018. That first payment was due in October of last year, and the second one is due in July. So we'll talk a little bit more about our lagging funding here in just a minute. Next slide. This slide gives you an idea of what the PSC's workload has been over the last few years. The blue color is the total number of filings that we have. The gray is telecom, orange are gas utilities, green electric utilities, and then we have some others you'll see there at the bottom, very small bars. Yellow is intrastate pipelines, light blue is the water companies. The red dotted line that you'll see across the screen is the combination of gas and electric, which really are the bulk of our cases and also represent the more complex filing that we have. You'll notice a significant spike in 2017, and that was a result of the new rules that the commission put into place in 2016, following Governor Mead's initiative to reduce our rules. The commission undertook a very thorough, complete review of our rules and met the 1/3 goal by reorganization and cutting out no longer relevant regulations. Once those were in place in 2016, every regulated utility had to file revised tariffs to be in conformance with those rules and regs. So we went through a very extensive process of the last couple of years of getting of all our utilities up to speed with their rules and regs to comply with the commission's rules. I would also note that it does seem our filings, while they look about standard, we aren't seeing much of a trend there, maybe a slight upward trend in the gas and electric. The filings do seem to be much more complex. We're going to talk later in the presentation about some issues, some current filings we have from Rocky Mountain Power, which is a 6-state utility, some very complex issues occurring across the footprint. We also now have several different rate-making mechanisms, more interveners, more diverse interests. And so while the caseload looks fairly stable, I would say that it has certainly increased in complexity. Next slide. Now we'll talk a little bit about the budget. Our budget has been relatively flat. The exception has been in the 100 series of our budget, which, as you know, are salaries and benefits for employees. Approximately 80% of our budget is in the 100 series, and those benefit and salary increases are outside of our control. The Public Service Commission has added no new positions since 2013, and the OCA was created in 2003 with 6 positions, and they today have 6 positions. The next slide is really the illustration of the budget. There's quite a bit on this slide, so I want to go through this fairly slowly and pretty carefully so you can see all the different information that's on this slide. The red line that you see going downward is the utility gross revenues that we've seen over the past few years. The green dots are the PSC budget, and you'll see that those are fairly stable. And the blue squares are the mill levy, and you can see a general trend upward, as I mentioned, approaching the three mill levy limit this year. We have seen a slight increase in utility gross revenues from 2015 to 2017 of about 1.75%. But since then, between 2017 and 2019, we saw almost a 2% decline. And then last year, we've seen a 3.25% decline, and we expect that decline to continue. Next slide. This slide gives you a little bit better pictorial demonstration of the relationship of our overall budget, which is in blue, to the 100 series, which is in red. And you'll see that those lines are almost, if not completely parallel. So any increase in our budget, our total budget, has been a result of those 100 series increases. The green line on the bottom are 200 series for administrative expenses, travel, etc. And the purple is a 900 series for any contractual relationships that we might need to have, which we keep at a very low limit. Over this period of time, 2009 to 2021, our total budget has increased by 18%, while the 100 series has increased by 21%. So the average annual increase in our total budget over that 12-year period has been 1.5%. And the CBO says the general rate of inflation over that same period is 1.8%. Next slide. As I mentioned, we are seeing declining utility gross intrastate revenues. There are several causes for that. The most basic and primary cause of the reduction in electric and natural gas load. We're also seeing reduced natural gas prices, decreased landlines, and the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which cut corporate tax rates. We were seeing this effect prior to anything going on with COVID. As you know, we approached the committee during interim to have this looked at. We are unsure at this point what the impact on COVID will be on intrastate revenues, but we anticipate we will see more decline than we had previously anticipated. As you start looking at the industry press around the country right now, it's too soon to say what those impacts are going to be in any one state. But EIA says electricity demand is down 6.6% in April across the country on average. Interestingly, no decreases in Texas or Florida, but the MISO footprint, for example, is reporting a 13% decline in load at this point. Italy, following their complete lockdown, has seen between an 18 to 21% decline in load. And we're not just seeing it in terms of total usage, we're also seeing it in time of usage. And so it's affecting peak load, and it will take some time for us to see what those impacts are. And as I mentioned earlier, those impacts are lagging for us. So anything that is happening because of COVID-19, the commission will not see in its funding until July of 2021. Next slide. This chart shows you what the assessment means to users of utilities in the state of Wyoming. Residential customers pay about 37 cents per month for both the PSC and the OCA. And you'll see the numbers there for commercial and industrial use as well. Next slide. I'm going to shift gears now and go through 4 different scenarios that we have put together at the commission to look at potential forecasts for utility revenue going forward. These first 2 anticipate current operations. One anticipates a 3% decline, which is the one that's on your screen today. All scenarios that you're going to look at assume no increases in our budget. So it looks at a completely even budget. You'll see that this one, the assessment level exceeds the 3 mil levy in fiscal year 2020 and goes to 3.4 by 2024. And so this is a impending issue for us, given just a potential 3% decline. If you'll go to the next slide, considering what we're seeing in other declines in load across the country, we've decided to do an 8% decline as well. Not only COVID, but the continuing economic challenges in Wyoming will also reduce intrastate load because of the lack of load. You'll see here that this looks at an 8% decrease over the next few years. And in that one, you'll see that the assessment level goes to 3.5 mils by 2023 and a little over 4 mils in 2024. The next 2 slides are ones that we have put together using projections that would assume the Wyoming Telecom Act would sunset in 2023. If that happens, the commission will no longer be able to assess telephone users for utility assessments. And so you'll see here with that decline of assessment revenue and what we'd be getting from utilities, that is a steeper line. This one back to the 3% decline. And you'll see that the levy approaches 4 mils by 2024. The last projection that we wanted to show you today is again the 8% decline with no telecom. And you'll see here that the assessment level exceeds 4.5 mils by 2024. So we can't be sure obviously how any of this will go, but we wanted to give you the range of what we think is realistic and possible given different funding scenarios. Next slide. So our recommendation and what we wanted to come today to talk with you about is proposing an amendment to Wyoming Statute 372107A, which is the assessment. And we would strike 3 mils and put in 5 of the gross Wyoming intrastate retail revenues. The potential impact of that, even if we got to the full 5 mils, which we do not anticipate for some time, would be an additional 16 cents for residential customers. So at that point, given what they're paying today with that increase, residential customers would then be paying about 53 cents per month to fund both the OCA and the PSC. We want to be very clear, though, that this doesn't change how we go about our process to form our budget. Elected officials preserve the control over our funding. The governor must review and recommend our budget, and the legislature must approve it. Next slide. So again, we just want to be clear, we're not here seeking increased budgets. We're here to protect our existing operations, given what's on the horizon for the state of Wyoming. We have sort of an inverse relationship with economic downturns. They seem to produce more applications and more complex issues for the commission to deal with than when the economics are good. The fact is, and what we've demonstrated today on those slides, is that 3 mils is insufficient to fund our existing operations. We do expect utility revenues to decline continually, some just due to what's happening with the Wyoming economy, and now with the COVID effect on loads, we expect that decline to be more than we had anticipated. And then again, just to be looking ahead and the potential loss of the telecom assessment in 2023 if that statute sunsets. So that concludes my presentation on the assessment issues. I don't know if we want to take questions on that now and then talk about emerging issues, or if you'd like me to continue, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions at this time? rolling quickly. I do not see any right now, Chairwoman. So if you'd continue, that'd be great.
Senator Case is raising his hand.
Senator Case, go ahead.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairwoman, is the assessment divided by customer class? Are the mill levies applied to each class separately, or are they kind of rolled all in and then redivided by consumption?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman, I could not hear all of your question.
Let me try again. I'm sorry.
That's better.
So is the assessment done by customer class? So the levies are done by the entirety of, say, the residential class, the commercial class, the industrial class? Or are they more blended together to get an average amount per unit of energy?
They are done by customer class, Mr. Chairman. I think that's correct. And those numbers that I talked to you earlier, the way that breaks down, residential class is about 11.7%, commercial 15.5, industrial 72.5, and others 0.23, which again, given that the Wyoming load is industrial is about a little over 70% of the load, what we're seeing in the economy, the general economy of Wyoming, is where a lot of those declining revenues are coming from.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Director, my question is about, I understand that you're going to ask us to increase the mill levy from, or the levy from 003 to 005. But before kind of someone would make that motion, I'm curious how you have or will respond to the governor's memo asking every agency to consider cuts for the future.
Ms. Fornstrom.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I guess the best answer to that question is we don't know. We are a self-funded agency. There isn't anything that happens at our agency that would benefit the general fund. And so obviously speaking on behalf and advocating for my agency, I would ask that if we're able to do this with the mill levy, if we can fund operations, that we should be allowed to do so. It has no impact on the general fund or the other issues affecting state government.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Madam Chairman, on slide 4, which is staffing comparisons, you know, it's pretty striking how many utilities that the PSC, Wyoming's PSC oversees in relationship to, say, Montana or even Oregon. Is part of that count the private water companies that you're also tasked with that maybe other states don't have that? And the second part of the question is on telecom. My belief is you have no oversight of cellular companies where the only is such as CenturyLink. If you could comment on those two as far as point of clarification for myself.
Ms. Fornstrom, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, you are correct that on slide 4, water companies are included in that number of utilities that we regulate. I would say to you that probably not every water utility that would be eligible for our regulation is included in that number. There are some of those water districts that don't find their way to us without a complaint or some other rate issue. So there may be some that aren't actually even included in that list. And as to telecom, you're correct, we don't have jurisdiction over cellular or broadband, for example.
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gary, I was wondering if you maybe could talk about if the mill increase will affect industrial users, so coal mines, oil and gas rigs, stuff like that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Fornstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Western, yes, it would affect everyone. So if we go back to that slide of what the cost is today, Um, Sorry, I should have these in better order. Slide 11. You'll see that, and as I mentioned towards the end, even if it went to the 5 mils, that would represent an increase from 37 cents to 53 cents for residential customers. So you could assume a similar percentage increase for industrial customers that pay that. Again, if it went clear up to the 5 mils, which we don't anticipate happening for some time. And I don't have the math here handy with me. Do we decide that was about a 20% increase? 16, no.
8%.
8% increase is what I'm being told for those customers. So if it went up to that mill, or whatever percentage increase would affect every class of customers.
Further questions for the Public Service Commission on their presentation or their assessment rate or the number of utilities they have to oversee and help manage, especially in difficult times? Seeing none at this time. Mr. Petrie, I see you're also in the Zoom. Did you have anything to add to Commissioner Fornstrom or any other member of the PSC wish to comment?
I think they're all good right now. So far, so good.
Right.
I'll finish up with the second topic that you put on our agenda item, Mr. Chairman, which were emerging issues. We thought it might be best to talk about those first by sector and then by rulemaking. So if we look at sector, you'll see the list of electricity issues that we have there. And I know many of you are quite familiar with those. You'll see that Rocky Mountain Power are the top 5 that we have listed there. We have numerous open dockets, and many of these are interrelated, very complex issues. We recently approved the new cost allocation agreement and the multi-state protocol, but that has several issues that will continue to come in front of the commission, most notably an exit plan for other states in the footprint to get out of the coal plants, and what that will look like, and how there's a whole new process associated with that. So that will produce some very complicated and challenging dockets coming. And it's continuing to be under negotiation. This was for a short period of time. There are numerous significant issues that remain unresolved that will require the commission's attention. As many of you may know, Rocky Mountain Power filed their integrated resource plan in October. The commission has 2 dockets on that one. We've opened an investigation, and we are having a 5-day hearing on that in July to look into the integrated resource plan. And then the second docket related to that is whether the commission will accept that plan for filing. We don't approve those plans. We only accept them for filing, but the investigation will help inform the acceptance docket. Another related docket is the depreciation case, which is also being really driven by what's happening with the coal units and the other energy policies of our sister states in the footprint. They also have a pending rate case. We'll be having that in October. We had scheduled that for 5 days. The parties have asked for an additional 3. So we're looking at an 8-day rate case there. I would note that the amount of the rate increase is not significant, less than 2%. But, obviously it's an open docket, so I don't want to say too much about it, but I understand there are some class cost of service and some different rate design issues associated with that one. We have several interveners, so we anticipate that will be a heavily contested docket as well. We've also opened recently an investigation in Converse County, service of mostly oil and gas load between the REA and Rocky Mountain Power footprints. So we're looking into that. We have had other general rate cases. We just finished one with MDU, and Dominions is pending. And then we have a difficult one with Precor, an REA that serves 8 of the largest coal mines in the country in the northeast part of our state. So they'll be coming in for their general rate case as well. We continue to have PURPA issues with qualifying facilities filing complaints. Again, I think those are only against Rocky Mountain Power. And we're also monitoring the FERC rulemaking associated with PURPA. So we stay very busy on those issues as well. And that doesn't include all the other issues that keep us busy, like market issues that are going on both with CAISO and the SPP. There are a lot of other issues going on, but those are the ones that we wanted to highlight for you today. In terms of gas dockets, we had a really significant docket late last year that consolidated the rate and tariff for all the Black Hills entities. They are now the largest gas utility in the state of Wyoming, having acquired 5 different utilities over the course of the past 8 or 9 years. And so we've now consolidated those into one rate. There are several mechanisms within that. So it was a complicated docket, but we worked our way through that one, and we'll see how that one goes going forward. We're also getting quite a bit of calls, or Mr. Petrie is, at least related to the Choice Gas program, some marketing issues and some difficulties that we're having there. We anticipate we're going to need to host a summit sometime this summer or early fall to try to resolve some of the issues that are coming up there. Then on the telecom front, we've had some challenges by changing funding mechanisms at the federal level, which are taken into account before we determine how much a telecom company is eligible for under the Wyoming Universal Service Fund. We have set an interim funding for this year, but anticipate that will be contested, and we'll have a contested case proceeding on that, tentatively scheduled for the first week of August. So we continue to work through these different FCC funding mechanisms. And then we also continue to be challenged by small water companies and the challenges to match our regulatory model with those small water districts and do the best we can to help them navigate what can be a complicated and expensive process.
Representative Sweeney, do you have a question real quick?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in relationship to your oversight, renewables, do they, the small under, I think it's 50 wind turbines, I can't remember the exact number of megawatts, but under PURPA, the only way really that you have any jurisdiction under renewables is such as a company like Rocky Mountain Power that has an integrated plan. Do you then have oversight of wind and solar?
Commissioner Fornstrom.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, as it relates to qualifying facilities, we may see those in a couple of different ways. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we do get complaints from qualifying facilities against utilities. Historically, in our case, that's only been Rocky Mountain Power. They may complain about whether Rocky Mountain Power acted in good faith in the negotiation process per Schedule 38, which is their tariff in Wyoming, whether the pricing streams are correct, interconnection issues. So a variety of things could come to us through the complaint process in front of the commission. The other docket that we've seen recently related to qualifying facilities was actually brought by Rocky Mountain Power. The Wyoming Commission has been delegated authority from FERC to determine certain issues. And so the case that they brought to us was to determine the minimum contract term. And that had been 20 years in Wyoming. And after a contested case hearing and testimony by several experts, we did lower that to 15 years, but there were several QFs that participated in that docket as well.
Satisfactory, Representative Sweeney?
Yes. So in this increase, it seems to me that you need more help. So, I mean, with the complicated issues that Wyoming has and continues to have. So I'm assuming you've explored that. Do you see with this increase in mill levy, are you suggesting, I know that's a sensitive issue, but it just seems to me we are going to get to a point where the PSC can't keep up. I'm amazed you guys keep up with what you do keep up with. So is that part of any discussion at this point?
Commissioner Fornstrom, good luck.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I did want to mention that in terms of getting some assistance for the IRP docket, for example, we received funding from the governor's office to hire a consultant, and that has been very helpful to us. That was an area that we felt we needed to bring on some deeper expertise on some specific issues. And so that is working very well, and we are grateful for that support. The next part, I'm not sure any agency director is ever supposed to say, but I will say this. I have not had any discussions about asking for new positions. I believe we are well situated. We have a very talented, hardworking, dedicated group of employees. What I don't want to do is lose one. I don't know how we would make a cut. And saying that, obviously, in response to Representative Connolly's question, I understand all of our sister agencies, and maybe us, will be going through some significant pain in terms of staffing. But I don't expect to ask for anyone else, but I sure couldn't tell you who I'd want to lose if we had to cut even one position.
Okay. Any further questions for the commissioner? Senator Case.
Well, I couldn't resist. And Madam Chairwoman, are you going to speak for the OCA as well of their staffing issues or not?
Mr. Freeman.
Because I'll tell you why, because I know they only have 6 people. Of course,
Speak loud, Senator Case.
we know that Denise Parrish, of course, has retired from the OCA, and she was very instrumental in the negotiations with Rocky Mountain Power over the new dividing of the assets and who gets coal and who doesn't. And so I'd like to know how that's played out, but maybe that's appropriate for Mr. Freeman, and I don't mean to force it on you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case. Mr. Freeman is here. I would just note the couple of observations I have, and then I'll let Mr. Freeman address that. Denise obviously was an extremely valuable part of what was happening at OCA, especially in regard to the multi-state protocol. She did do some succession planning. It's difficult to transfer her knowledge. I understand that, but she did bring someone in, and I think they've done a good job. That's the person that actually testified at the hearing on the MSP, not Ms. Parrish. And I was also just observed that we were pleased. The OCA was very aggressive about getting those 2 new positions that they had advertised and filled. And so he is back up to full staff, and I think he was very pleased with the level of talent he was able to attract, but I'll let him answer the rest of that.
Okay. I guess, Mr. Freeman, welcome to Revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and forgive me, Co-Chair Case. I was sitting doing my social distancing and I had a hard time hearing the question, but I think it related primarily to MSP and what we're doing with that. As Chairman Fornstrom indicated, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, we did anticipate, and Denise was gracious enough to let me know well in advance of her retirement that she was going to go. And she also helped me select an analyst in our office who has been in our office since 2012. Anthony Ornalis is his name. Very, very bright guy. He has been working in tandem with Denise over about the last 1.5 or 2 years. Been to all the MSP meetings, is thoroughly up to speed on it. And we have in our office a gentleman by the name of Ivan Williams, whom I'm sure you know, Senator Case, who has also been to all the meetings. In addition to being an attorney, Ivan is also an accountant and a very bright guy, and has many, many years of experience, not only at the OCA, but he was on staff at the commission, as was I, for many years before we went to the OCA. And so Ivan is another resource that we put on that to make sure that we have it covered. I take an active role in that. That is an area that both Mr. Ornalis and Mr. Williams cover. They go to the meetings. They brief me constantly on the developments with MSP. And so I'm confident, Senator Case, that we have that covered. And we will continue to aggressively pursue that issue to make sure that Wyoming customers are not allocated a disproportionate share of the system costs to be paid in their rates, and that we maintain our flexibility with regard to resource choices. And really MSP is in conjunction, is fairly intertwined with the integrated resource planning process at Rocky Mountain Power. I have been doing that. In fact, in the investigation that is underway at the commission, I filed testimony in that case to make sure that the commission is fully informed. I've been part of Rocky Mountain Power's integrated resource planning process for many years. So I think between the three of us and hopefully bringing on my two new recruits and some of the specialized experience that they have, we feel pretty good that we're going to be able to cover all the bases on that.
Anyone else have questions for the Office of Consumer Advocate while we have Mr. Freeman before us? Seeing none at this time. Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman, for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, before we entertain a motion, I believe one's coming regarding the request from Chairman Fornstrom. I'll let Ms. Fornstrom have the floor again and finish her testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one more slide to finish up this emerging issues topic that just lists the rulemakings that are going on at the commission. Chapters 1 and 2 we've had out earlier in or late last year into this year that are just administrative edits. Those have been through the process awaiting Governor Gordon's signature. You may recall the non-situs CPCN law that you passed last year. And so we had rules drafted to implement that part, and we've paired that with some issues related to cooperative securities filings, and those are out for public comment now. That comment deadline is May 29th. We have another one out for comment right now, which is the definition of new entrants under the Telecom Act, which really bears on entities that are eligible to receive WSF funding. That comment deadline is June 19th, 2020. And then the one that we've been undertaking and I testified about a few times during this year's session was implementation of Senate File 159 and Senate File 21. I know you just had a discussion about this year's Senate File 159, but this relates to last year's Senate File 159 on utilities making a good faith effort to sell otherwise retiring coal units. It was amended this year with Senate File 21. We had those draft rules ready to go, but we wanted to see if any changes that might occur this session. That happened with 21. We modified those rules, sent them back out for public comment. This is sort of an informal process at this point. Those comments came to us on May 15th. Our next technical conference, which will be the fourth one we've had on this issue, will be on June 4th. And we hope to get those in place then back into the formal process of a comment period and a hearing on those. The time period that we're looking at right now in those is that those notices to retire those units would have to be filed at the commission to allow this process to occur 24 months prior to any retirement. And given Rocky Mountain Power's plans that they've announced to close Jim Bridger 1 on January 1st, 2023, that would make their application, their notice under this process due to us Q4 of this year. And so we've been working really hard, and we've had great input from stakeholders. It's been a good process to get those in place so everybody knows the rules of the game for this first run under Senate File 159. And then the other one, House Bill 200, that will require a similar extensive stakeholder process. And given the relative dates in that statute that was passed this year, we don't anticipate undertaking that stakeholder process until Q2 of 2021, but that will take up much of our year next year, I'm sure. Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I am finished.
Committee, any further questions for Commissioner Fornstrom or the members of the Public Service Commission or the Office of Consumer Advocate? Seeing no further questions at this time, anyone wish to entertain a motion related to the ask of the PSC? Representative, Mr. Obermueller, do you have a question for the PSC? Maybe not. Representative Connolly.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I thought maybe you would go to public comment before entertaining a motion, but it's up to you, whatever.
Oh, sure. We'll take public comment. You have the floor, Mr. Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for butting in. I'm happy to do public comment later if it's if that's better for you.
Is it related to the PSC assessment ratio? Then that would be good. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity. I just want to recall the committee's attention to slide number 11 about the customer classes and the monthly ratepayer costs. And to just remind the committee that industrial, of course, includes most of my members. And I think Chairman Fornstrom mentioned the percentage that is paid by industrial, which again is a lot of my members. So, Mr. Chairman, I would just I would urge some caution and thoughtfulness as you move forward with this. Electricity costs are among the highest input costs for my members, and an increase like this, which is about 72% of all of this, would of course be a pretty significant increase for my members at perhaps the most difficult time. So I think there could be further discussion. I don't pretend to know enough about whether or not different classes can be worked out, but hearkening back to the discussion from this morning and comments from Mr. McVeigh about broadening and expanding the tax base, that perhaps maybe 72% on industrial is not quite the right mix, that if there's a way to move forward there without this added increase, which is in fact particularly difficult on our legacy fields and our small operators in places like the Bighorn, smaller operators in places like the Bighorn Basin. So, Mr. Chairman, I would simply urge caution on this.
I appreciate those comments and think that's certainly fair as you speak for a majority of people who would be paying an increase. Representative Connolly, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it appropriate to make a motion?
I believe it is at this time, yes.
All right, then in order to further this discussion for the next meeting, I make a motion to have a bill draft. So that would modify 37.2.107A to change the assessment rate from 0.003 to 0.005.
Okay, Representative Sweeney, is that a second or do you have a question?
I really had a question for Pete, but
Would you want to second it just in case, or let me get a second for Representative Connolly's motion first? Would anyone like to second Representative Connolly's motion? Going once, going twice. Not seeing a second. Representative Black?
No. No.
Mr. Chairman, you missed Representative Roscoe, I believe.
Okay, Representative Roscoe, sorry, I'm having to look at 14 screens and I'm looking for blue hands. Representative Roscoe, thank you for seconding. All right, motion is on the table. Representative Sweeney, you said you had a question for Mr. Obermuller?
If I could, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, now would be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Pete, I agree with you. Is that rate as you see it? So that's basically $200 plus a month to an individual ratepayer, or is that based? I'm trying to figure out if that's kind of based on actual usage, isn't it? So this is an average cost. So a large user would possibly be extensively more than this per month. Am I looking at this correctly?
Mr. Obermuller, is Representative Sweeney somewhat on target there?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I appreciate it. And in fact, it may be a question better directed to Chairman Fornstrom to explain how that works. Again, I confess I am not the expert about this, but I do know that, and already I've heard from a medium-sized operator, that electricity costs are around 65 to 70% of the total operating cost. So whether it's a 1% increase or an 8% increase or whatever it is, making operating costs in Wyoming higher right now perhaps isn't the best policy choice.
Okay. Commissioner Fornstrom, let me throw a question at you. Is there a way to differentiate, let's say, a residential versus commercial versus industrial user when it comes to your assessment rate? Has that ever been contemplated, or is it a flat rate currently?
Mr. Chairman, the assessment is based on actual usage. The customer classes I gave you are reflective of how much load of total Wyoming load are in those classes. So of all the electricity used in the state of Wyoming, 11.68% of that is used by residential customers. 72.56% of electricity consumed in the state of Wyoming is by industrial customers. And Representative Sweeney said it correct that these are average bills. For example, the average industrial bill in the state of Wyoming per month is about $56,000. And so a $56,000 bill, there's $200 in there to operate the PSC and the OCA. And we're the ones that are available when they're having issues with their electricity, with their utility, and those kinds of things to navigate those complaints for them, and to also ensure that electricity rates are not increased without a thorough vetting process at the Public Service Commission. A lot of the industrial bills that we have in that category are over $1 million a month. So that just gives you some sort of reference for the kind of bills that we're talking about.
Okay. Representative Sweeney, you have a follow-up question for Commissioner Fornstrom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So where do irrigators fall into any of this rate structure? Like, do they fall under commercial, or does that go to other? If I might, I'm just curious about that also.
Ms. Fornstrom, if you
Chairman,
know.
Many irrigators would be in the other category.
Thank you.
Further questions for Ms. Fornstrom? Senator Case, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is kind of a bit of a sticky wicket, and I think that the oil and gas folks, especially those that have stripper wells, that use a lot of electricity to move a lot of water mostly and very little oil. It's very expensive for them. They've been upset about the rate increases that they've seen for about, I can't remember how many years, but as you know, we have a colleague in the Senate that often tries to advocate for their causes, and it has been a dramatic increase. All that being said, we need the PSC, we need the OCA, and we have to figure out a way to fund them. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same manner that it is now, but especially as there's so much transition happening in these industries, maybe we could do a temporary rate boost for them, and hoping that things get more normal down the road. And we can, at our next meeting or whenever we take this bill up, discuss different ways to do the assessment that might unburden others. But I do have to point out that when you have a $50,000 plus electric bill, $200 ain't much. And I think in the end, probably the OCA and the commission, you know, I think part of what gets under the industrial skin is that they pay for their own representation. They have an organization, and they fight in the forums offered at the PSC. Whereas mostly residential and other consumers, they rely on the OCA to support them. And there's a caveat to that, because the OCA is charged with representing all consumers, and they do that. But I'm just saying, we've got to keep the institution going. We might figure out a different way to do it, but I hope we'd support having a bill on the table at perhaps our next meeting or other time at the call of the chair.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I totally agree with Co-Chairman Case's remarks. We've got to figure it out. My question is, does the motion would it be appropriate to build into the drafting some different mechanism breakdown on rate classes and ratepayers to make it a little more equitable instead of on the burden of the industrial customers. It's just, the majority of it definitely appears to be on that. And I just am wondering if the bringer of the motion and the second had contemplated that in their motion.
I'm not sure it was contemplated, but I would think if the motion passes to have a bill drafted, we could certainly ask LSO to come up with some additional possibilities of differentiating rates or maybe different mechanisms. And certainly, I think the motion is a 5% from the 3%, but it could be 4%. We could certainly adjust that number at our meeting when we have a bill draft in front of us, if that works. Representative Hallinan, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to amend this motion to 4 mills. I think that the idea that we're going to need 5 mills was a projection of what's going to be needed in the future. I think 4 mills is the appropriate amount to allow the commission to go forward. And if it needs to be raised to 5 mills in the future, we can do it at that time. So I would move that we amend this motion by having a 4 mill increase permitted to the commission.
Representative Connolly, do you want to revise your motion to 4?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Hallinan, I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
Representative Roscoe, would you just say nod, or is that okay with you? Okay, seeing the second consent, now it's having a bill drafted with a 4 mil instead of the 3 mil. So back to discussion on the potential of a bill draft. Further discussion?
Question.
Seeing no further discussion and question being called, let me switch to gallery view. All in favor of the motion, if you would raise your hand and turn your cameras on. 2, 4, 6, 7. All right, I got at least 7 yeses, so that motion carries. LSO, you're directed to draft a 4 mil increase for the Public Service Commission. And Josh, if you'd maybe research some flexibility, meet with the PSC and see if there are various options to have differential rates or maybe a better price point and information when we get the bill draft in front of us to proceed. That, Representative Connolly.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, just for clarification, it's not a 4 mil increase, it's an increase from 3 to 4, so 1 mil increase.
That's what I meant to say. Thank you, Representative Connolly. Mr. Anderson, that works. Any questions on that bill draft moving forward?
I got it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. While we have the Public Service Commission and the OCA, any other questions or discussion to come before them? Going once. All right, not seeing anything further for the Public Service Commission. Thank you very much, Chairman Fornstrom, and the rest of the PSC who's joining us in the Capitol currently that the other members of the committee couldn't see there to back you up, but appreciate you all showing up in person today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
In committee, we are running about 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is unheard of for the Revenue Committee. And I know we do have some public comment lined up for the 4 o'clock hour, so I hesitate to start early before all of those people are joining us. So I think the best way to proceed is maybe take a 15-minute break, reconvene at 4 for what promises to be a lively public comment session. Before the break, anyone have any burning questions or thoughts?
Yeah, let's just take a 10-minute break and get to it.
Well, because we're running ahead of the agenda, Representative Blackburn, I don't want to leave anybody out. So let's do 4. Representative Connolly?
Mr. Chairman, just so I don't ask this at the end, I'm curious if the chairs could talk a little bit about tomorrow. And in particular, I'm curious about the review of legislation. I mean, we've got a whole group of bills that we've discussed in the past. It's only scheduled for 2 hours. So I'm curious, what's the plan of the chairs in terms of that review?
Well, I can give you my belief, and I guess I'll be very honest that I'm not sure Chairman Case and I have greatly discussed how it's going to work, but we do have, what, 7 pieces or 8 pieces of legislation on our agenda. I think we're going to review those, certainly discuss what happened in maybe the House introductory votes or the Senate introductory votes on each of the 8 listed bills before us. And then we will get a sense of the committee based on what we know of the impending revenue deficit, which avenues they might like to pursue. I'm probably personally of the belief that every option should remain on the table until we get a better handle on the volatility of certainly oil prices and maybe the extent of what the revenue picture with the COVID-19 continued strain on the state budget is. So it would be my belief or hope that we discuss each of those, see what the committee wants to perhaps immediately pursue, and then any other bills from the last session that raise revenue, cut government or services, or have other innovative ways to protect the citizenry of Wyoming, that we would have probably a very long 2-hour discussion on all of those topics as well. I think we have 9 people for public comment who'd like to speak. So I'm not sure any more than that, but my co-chairman can certainly express his thoughts on what might be his preferred method of dealing with tomorrow morning's agenda. Senator Case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Connolly and everybody. It's not my intention to have a beauty contest on the bills and eliminate any of them off the bat. I just want to just say that. With our financial crisis, with our charge from Management Council, with the need to work through this interim and support special sessions, I don't think we can take anything off the table at this time. And so, I mean, of course, the committee can force any motions they want. They can certainly do that. But I think it would be inappropriate, and the chairman and I have definitely talked about this. This is just a review of kind of where we are, what these could have raised, why they may or may not deserve attention in the future. And then it helps us to schedule the interim, which, as you all know, is a 4-meeting interim now, and maybe even more work if it continues to have the electronic components. The immensity of the job in front of the Revenue Committee, and frankly, the rest of the legislature, the Appropriations Committee, and the executive branch to balance our budget is, I don't know, it's a moonshot almost. So we definitely shouldn't go through that list and throw a bunch of them out. I'll tell you that. That's my 2 cents, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, with that, committee, we will recess until 4 o'clock in about 13 minutes. Reminder to turn off your mics and your videos, and we'll see you back shortly. All right, committee, we'll start pulling it back together here. So originally your co-chairman and I, when we set up the agenda 3 weeks ago, didn't quite know what the revenue report was going to look like, what the recommendations were going to be, what we were really in for. And so, I would say I personally thought it might go a little longer today than usual, and we'd be here at 7 o'clock tonight. And it went a little quicker, I think. Perhaps maybe some of you knew what was coming, and some of the shock was, how do we deal with this? We're not quite sure. But we did just kind of have the public comment at both of our satellite locations here in Cheyenne and in Lander for members of the public to come in and testify about what they thought of possible further government cuts, elimination of programs or services, what they'd like to see in the future towards economic development or different possible avenues to stabilize our budget. And so with that, we're officially in our public comment period. But the two people I was expecting to Zoom in have not quite logged into the chat room yet. And the two people here in Cheyenne who are going to testify during public comment have both asked to talk tomorrow during the public comment periods, one during the bill presentation and then one during general public comment tomorrow. So there is no one here in Cheyenne, Senator Case, for the public comment portion of the agenda in person. I don't know if you have someone in Lander who wishes to address the committee.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have three gentlemen that are talking at a socially distanced basis. But Mr. Kaysen, were you intending to make any public comment? And Mr. Garrett, were you? Okay, thank you. And the mayor of Shoshone would like to do public comment tomorrow. Oh, and we'll also have more assessors here tomorrow.
Well, with that committee, I hear movement in the hall, but I think it's people visiting the Capitol. Is there anything anyone wishes to say? I know we have a long day tomorrow of reviewing bills and tax structures and possible remedies for the situation we're in. But if anyone wanted to, generally address the rest of us and share your thoughts or comments or any bill ideas you may want drafted or may already be in the process of drafting, certainly we're happy to entertain any of those thoughts at this time. Representative Hallinan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really think that we need to look at a revenue bond. And I would suggest of about approximately 500 million. That would obviate the need for the tremendous cuts that we need to do, and also the tremendous tax increases that are talked about. I think the problem is likely to be temporary. I think that definitely the COVID thing is going to be temporary. And I think that the issue of oil and gas and even coal is going to change over the next 4 or 5 years. So I think if we borrowed, say, 500 million at 20 years loan, 1% I expect is probably what we could get that money for. And that would be, we could pay that back at 25 million or thereabouts per year. And I think that would get us past this dreadful situation that we're in right now. And I think that's the ideal solution to our problem. So with that in mind, Mr. Chairman, that's what I think we need to do. Thank you.
Okay. Representative Western, you are officially next, and then Representative Connolly after that. Can't hear you yet, Representative Western.
Oh,
There you go. Yep.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I certainly appreciate the good intent behind the previous speaker. I think if you really look at the numbers, I think the last thing we need to be doing is borrowing money. I mean, like every dollar that you borrow, you have to figure out how are we going to pay this back. And given the spending cuts that we're going to have to go through, if we're spending money, it should be going to institutions inside the state of Wyoming, not to capital markets or capital borrowers across the country or the globe. I think living on a credit card when we don't have a way to pay it back is quite simply a very financially risky and unsustainable course of action, regardless of how well reasoned it may be. It just puts us in a further precarious situation. Look at states that have started borrowing tons of money. Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, some of these other states. I mean, some of them have almost a junk bond credit rating. I don't want that to be Wyoming. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate those comments. I mean, we haven't had to do bonding in the state since the late 90s, and coal bed methane saved our bacon, and investment income for the past 3 bienniums has saved our bacon. And our three-legged stool, I think, as you heard as all three legs are pretty short right now. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do think Representative Hallinan's suggestion is interesting. And I would like to, as an in-between of Representative Western and Representative Hallinan, is actually have a good presentation on what bonding would mean and what we could use it for. So for example, I might disagree with Representative Hallinan that we should have $500 million just to backfill because of the hope that things will change. I'm not as optimistic, Representative Hallinan, but I do think that the cost of money right now is so incredibly low that our incredibly good rating that we have right now puts us at an incredibly favorable position in the market. And maybe if we do have to go forward with some capital construction, that's where I might want to think that maybe we do revenue bonds for capital construction. I mean, so I would like to see a presentation on revenue bonding and what it could mean. So that's my first. But my next ones are, I think that we have a limited number of bills that we're reviewing, and that those are the ones that passed. But going back to early this morning, there's a whole series of other ways to raise revenue that didn't pass the committee, and that I would be interested in us kind of revisiting those. And those would include an income tax, the expansion of the sales tax to the sale of services, to increasing the sales tax by a penny. I mean, those are three right off the top of my head. And then a real estate transfer tax, something that we really haven't addressed very much in this committee. So at least 4 additional issues that I'd like to put on the table for tomorrow. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, can I ask, did you hear me? You look like you were frozen.
Oh, my computer totally went out in the Capitol. Now I'm back. So I missed everything you just said, Representative Connolly. I'm sure it was brilliant. Can you hit the high points for me one more time?
Well,
it was brilliant, and Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm sorry, but Representative Connolly, we didn't mean to leave anything off the table. We put a catch-all for other bills. I think your suggestion of adding those things are good. I'll add my weight to it.
Okay. Thank you.
And you better explain to your chairman.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. First, I asked for a presentation on bonding so that to understand about what were the possibilities in terms of going after revenue bondings, thinking that we have an incredibly good rating right now. I might want to look at it for capital construction rather than just backfilling. But then I went to kind of the presentation from first thing this morning, and some of the bills that were discussed but didn't pass the revenue committee that are revenue generators: an income tax, expanding the sales tax to include services, increasing the sales tax by a penny, and then also a real estate transfer tax. Those are the kinds of issues that I'd like to put on the table as well tomorrow.
Excellent. I think my video is back and going. I'm not sure what happened there in the state capitol. Other people, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would echo Representative Connolly's list that I think when we're looking, we need to be looking at all of these solutions. And it seems to me one of the quicker pieces, certainly not the answer, is the 1% sales tax, and maybe it'll generate 140 million. I don't know with the current climate, and but I think as we heard Director Noble say this morning, it would take until October possibly to get that stood up and put in place if we were to do that at the second special session. But and just hopefully that may be put forth on the other previous bills. And then to my second subject is, are we under the item 15 on the COVID-19 topics, do you feel, I'm hoping that during that time period, which will probably be after 5, that the review of the Tax Reform 2000 document, the Wyoming Taxpayers Associations, are they going to be part of that discussion? They've submitted documents, and I'm just curious on the chair's take of that.
Sure, Senator Case, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to that, I did distribute out those documents from Tax Reform 2000, and they were kindly, the Taxpayers Association helped me with that, so I'm grateful to them. Our thinking, and Mr. Co-Chairman, correct me if I got this wrong, but I think we're thinking of doing a pretty deep dive on Tax Reform 2000 at our next meeting. It has actually been suggested that we invite some of the principals from that here, including some of the folks that were intimately involved in that, like John Hines, maybe former Governor Geringer, maybe Dan Sullivan, and there may be others, not to overdo it, but to try to bracket the Tax Reform 2000 conclusions and bring them into context for now. So that's still in the works, Representative Sweeney. We absolutely want to go there, but we weren't intending for that to be tomorrow afternoon. We still have quite a list from the Management Council to review tomorrow afternoon, actually. And Mr. Chairman, while I have the floor, I know that Mr. Noble has some comments to follow up on the whole discussion with monthly ad valorem. So when you get a chance.
Sure. Mr. Noble, if you'd like to speak now, and also if you have any thoughts on what bonding could look like, and at a very cursory glance, perhaps, where you could answer Representative Connolly's question if you have any thoughts on bonding as well. But go ahead, Mr. Noble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the confusion earlier today. I did send Josh Anderson the pieces of the legislation that I thought were in conflict. As it turns out, there are sections of the bill which apply to the Department of Revenue, and that's typically what will happen once we get to the point of actually collecting ad valorem taxes on the same schedule as we collect the severance tax. But until that point in time, it'll be the county treasurer that is actually collecting that tax. So I guess in a way, we really need to host that meeting next week and get everybody together and talk about it. But I wanted you to be aware of the fact that the Enrolled Act itself is fine. It's just the fact that there are two pieces to it. One which the department will be a part of, and one which the counties will be collecting on. I think it's kind of important that we do get together and kind of discuss what that's actually what that would actually look like. There is also another piece to this that still needs to be drafted, and that is when you begin moving the companies that are now paying monthly to the same schedule as what they're paying on severance taxes. And that I think is what's contemplated in the very last part of the Enrolled Act. So I apologize for stirring things up, but the fact is it probably needed to be, because we need to talk about it, obviously, with everybody. The issue with bonding, I think, is probably a discussion to be held with the state treasurer, potentially the auditor's office. They'd have a much more of a grasp on how to implement that should they choose to do it, but it is something that I'm sure they would have some expertise in.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think when we talk about, studies and some modeling of increasing sales tax and looking at what's available out there, I would love if, to what extent there's available, any kind of analysis about how that works when we have record high unemployment in Wyoming. I mean, we're pulling at one string, and I don't know how things start unraveling a little bit. And it does concern me that you have people who are out of work. I think we're going to start seeing an onslaught of bankruptcy proceedings. And I think all of the modeling and understanding we have of increasing things like sales tax are with the assumption that people can pay their taxes and pay an increased tax. And so that is my concern is, we can't just look at one side of the picture of, we want more money as a state, so we're going to increase taxes without looking at the feasibility of whether or not those taxpayers are able to absorb those demands.
Agreed. And I think it's really difficult because we've modeled kind of what each of those tax rates are for sales or property. We're in a whole new environment where we're not sure our numbers of here's what we think that will raise, or even if our cuts, here's what we think we can cut. In this environment, everything's so volatile. I think you heard Don Richards say it today. I mean, we could be 50% off either way still. So not that we're flying blind, but I think the difficulty I heard this morning from the testimony is there's no easy answer, even in taxation. I mean, if any kind of corporate income tax or personal income tax or property tax increase, those won't go into effect until after 18 months in some cases, 2 years if we were to get some of those systems for like a personal income tax or a corporate tax set up. That's way past the point we can solve the current problem in front of us. And so I just don't know. We may have to go through the entire LSRA, and then we'll be on thoughts and prayers a little bit that whatever cuts, not even whatever cuts, all of the cuts and any kind of revenue increases we raise, we won't see them come into fruition until the 23 biennium. And if they don't work at that point, there's no LSRA left to fall back on. And so I don't think anyone envies our job as a revenue committee or as a legislature in this upcoming, 18-month period where we could have the best of intentions of cutting left and right and impacting services and programs and anything that's not constitutional. And we don't even know for sure it's going to work based on our projections and what the environment could look like in 2 years. And I do have a lot of hope with Representative Hallinan that this could be a huge, dive for about 3 years and it could all come back. But the problem is we don't have any immediate mechanisms available to us to weather the storm besides the LSRA. As Mr. Richards said, at the end of this, relying on the LSRA, there is no more LSRA in 18 months. And we don't know if what we do is gonna get us through the future. So it's pretty dire because even the best plans we have in front of us, we can't prove they're gonna work with the current numbers all over the map. And that's my biggest concern going forward is we may have to cut even deeper than people feel at all comfortable with or raise some revenues higher than people feel at all comfortable with on the understanding that it could be so much worse than we even understand. And I think you have to hope for the best, but you have to plan for the worst. And maybe some future legislature can come back and say, hey, we did it too much. Just like I think the federal government shut down the country a little too much. And you'll have lots of people saying, well, we flattened the curve. And if we hadn't done it, it would have been worse. And, we'll have probably decades of people saying what we should have done. But this is one of those cases with our budget. You may have to make it even worse than we think, just in case. And so that's what frightens me and will keep me up all summer is, how much cuts, how much taxes, and we can't afford not to take the worst case scenario into account. All right, so with that, any other thoughts before we end our Tuesday meeting, before we get going tomorrow and talk about all of the revenue and all the cuts that lie before us? none of which sound fun or enjoyable, right?
Senator Ellis was trying to get your attention, I think.
Senator Ellis, go ahead again.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I just want to say is we're talking about things to consider, just both sides of the coin. That's what my point was. I'm not saying one thing or another. I just, just looking at, government orders that restricted beauty shops and barber shops to close, and knowing the impact that those folks had. And then we just had a special session to allow for some business relief, only then to have the discussion about charging sales tax on those services performed. Like, if I were a business owner, I just would be like feeling a little whiplash through all of this. And so I just want to make sure that we are raising that other piece of who is this is going to affect, and what taxes are those going to be.
Yeah. Representative Roscoe, did you have comments?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd sort of forgotten what I was going to say, but one thing that would help me a lot is to know in the last 3 years what we have cut, the last 2 years, what we have already cut out of government. And that would help me with my constituents. And I think in regard to what Senator Ellis brought up is the fact that the people that are unemployed and in trouble, I think certain bills will affect them more than others. And so we should take that into consideration, such as the real estate transfer tax really wouldn't affect those sort of people. But a lot of other ones would. And then I think we can also maybe fashion these bills so that if things do come back, then we could rescind or reduce some of these taxes. But I kind of agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that we sort of have to plan for the worst case scenario, because I think it might be kind of last longer than we all expect or would hope for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Case.
Well, we're leaving tonight, and we had the most extraordinary presentation of how bad it is. I bet no one in Wyoming's history has ever had the presentation that we had this morning, where we could literally cut a third of our government and we'd still eat up the LSRA. And so, it's a very unprecedented time. People have taken terrible hits in business and people, trying to stay on their feet. And we're not done with hits, but we have to plan for this state going forward. Do we want to eliminate funding of higher education? Do we want to eliminate the Department of Health? We didn't even talk today about our local government partners and how badly they're going to be impacted, and we need to do that. So it is a very dramatic time. It is going to hurt. We have tough decisions to make, and this committee's got to be the one to make them. And I have confidence in all of you, but honestly, we cannot make it painless. That's not in the cards.
With that, any further business to come before the Revenue Committee tonight, or we're all go home and think of the best possible discussion points to bring forward tomorrow to get the state having a viable future? Seeing no further public comment. Oh, Representative Sweeney.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So is there any plan, would we have any bills to put forward for the second special session at the end of June? Or is that up for consideration or any discussion tomorrow?
I haven't talked to leadership that much. My understanding of what's coming forward at the end of June is getting the end of the biennium on track, looking at some of the tips and the reserve accounts that we can use, and getting a better plan for the next biennium. that was the plan, knowing the information we know now about how bad it might be. And listening to Mr. Richards earlier, I think he made some great points that any cuts or revenue enhancers or tips or streams that we can do now with a 28-month horizon is so much easier to do than if we wait till next January. What that looks like, I don't know. What I would say is that all of the bills that this committee brought forward in February, things like a fuel tax increase or a corporate income tax, or a bill that, well, at least some members of this committee brought forward on further cutting government, the number of cities, counties, community colleges, even cutting our own legislative branch on, do we really need 60 of us? I think a lot of those bills don't need an immense amount of work that we just looked at 4 months ago. And so some of those could be brought back in the mix. It really, I think, depends on the overall leadership of the legislature and in concert with the executive branch. If to bring any of those bills forward, we need to have a 5 or 6 or 7 day special session because of the constitutional requirements on when taxation bills can be brought. Part of me, I don't know if we're ready with the volatility still. We don't have a good handle on oil prices, on the extent of COVID-19. I'm not sure we'll be ready for that discussion at the end of June, even if we do need to have it. I don't know if the entire legislature is ready for that discussion. We're 4 weeks away. Are we ready to make that deep dive into programmatic cuts? I don't think so. I think the executive branch is going to have to be in charge of that discussion moving forward over the summer. I think we'll be better positioned in September to really have that look forward of where are we as a state. But I don't know if we're going to be ready to have the end all be all of discussions at the end of June right now. So that's my personal thoughts. Representative Blackburn. Representative Blackburn, no? How about you keep working on Representative Blackburn?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I apologize. So we're looking at 7 bills tomorrow. Why are we looking at those? Aren't we looking at those to, I think 5 of them failed and 2 of them passed. Aren't we looking to modify them and or resurrect them? Isn't that our purpose tomorrow, to look at those bills?
I think certainly it was for the interim over the course of 4 meetings to look at that. Representative Sweeney's question was, is this committee going to propose any immediate solutions for the special session at the end of June? And any of those concepts, depending how the special session looks, any member of the legislature can bring forward those bills, but I don't anticipate this committee sponsoring any of those bills for the session in 4 weeks. I don't think that's our charge from Management Council, or am I asking for any votes the next 24 hours for us to send any of those bills forward to the special session as a revenue committee sponsored bill. And my co-chair can think about his thoughts here for a second. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It occurred to me that Mr. Richards this morning did give us an idea for a potential, I think, bill that could be for the next special session, which is to capture a tip that would otherwise happen next year, and the recognition that there would need to be legislation in order to capture that tip before it went into permanent savings. So maybe we could take a look at that.
Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to circle back around, one of the things I was wondering about, and I don't even know if it could happen, but Representative Hallinan brought for the second time the constitutional amendment, and it didn't raise as much on the school foundation. I hope Representative Hallinan will join in, but is that type of thing possible during a special session, and would it be able to get on the ballot this fall? if, and I'm guessing that will take a super majority or 2/3 to move forward. Is that the type of thing that might be resurrected that we could move forward if Representative Hallinan was willing to bring that forward again? We were close this last time.
And I know Senator Case and I are both on corporations, but I would say if there's anything for a constitutional amendment change or revision, it would probably, if we got it done to the end of June, I think you could get it on the November ballot. Anything later than it's, I want to say it's, I can't remember, it's 45 or 60 days. I think it's 60 days before the general. I think we'd be too late if we tried to do any constitutional changes at a later special session, say in September. There's some conversation if we need to have another one that late, that probably would be too late for a constitutional amendment change. So it's probably incumbent on well, the minority leader and Senator Case and I, and really all of us, to start having these conversations the next couple of weeks, that if we anticipate any type of constitutional change, be it on an income tax or on school of funding, or on something like Representative Hallinan's proposal to do some tips or hold some funding back from going into permanent savings, those conversations need to happen pretty quick in the next couple of weeks to get a bill draft prepared. And I'm not saying that we're going to do that, but I think that's a pretty serious thing to change the Constitution. And if we have some ideas like that out there, we need to be working on those the next couple of weeks. So I think a lot of us will talk offline on what that looks like. And Senator Case, if you want to join in right now, I'd be happy for your thoughts on what you see moving forward.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Going back to the Don Richards comments that if we're going to make changes, it's better to do it early because it's trying to turn a ship. But that rings in my mind, so that if there was overwhelming support for some issues, and I think it's a possibility. With regards to the constitutional amendment, you have to publicize it, and there's publishing requirements at the Secretary of State's office. There's also an education process that has to take, it has to occur with our citizens. It would have to be like an immediate push to try to get that done and move that forward, in my mind, and then have it pass the special session early enough that could begin before the end of June. I think that's a pretty big lift. I'm not opposed to talking about it, but most of the time it sounds a little rushed to me. I will say that.
Agreed. Further public comment to come before us today? Well, seeing none, and seeing that the Secretary of State's election filings is out, and several of us got opponents.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Case?
We have a live comment from Lander, and give me a second to kind of arrange this.
Okay.
It seems to be live and spontaneous, just like the legislature is supposed to be.
Excellent. We can hear you.
Webcam on in Lander. It'd be the Lander public comment.
Unmute.
I'm looking for it.
I'm trying. Katie or Dave, if you're on, there we go. No, if you could unmute that.
And can we get a video feed too, or do I have to do that from this computer?
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, this is the same issue that the Cheyenne comment had, where you have to unmute it from that computer and you'll have to start its own video again.
I'll do my best.
Mr. Garrett's having second thoughts, but
I'm sure I can speak much more eloquently than I can here.
We can certainly hear him.
Yeah, that's probably it.
so actually, Mr. Garrett, you're on video and you should have sound. Let's test it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speak louder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm appearing to you. My name is Richard Garrett, and today I'm appearing simply as a constituent of Senator Cale Case. I only want to thank you for your service and to recognize that the compassion that you've shown, particularly in this conversation just in the last half hour.
Speak louder. Can I get you? I'm sorry, everybody,
but we can hear him.
You can hear him now. The problem for me is the sound comes in one computer and the video's on another computer, so it's confusing. Believe me, I'm at the limits here. Mr. Garrett, speak as loud as you can and go ahead and maybe start over.
Yes, again, Richard Garrett, and I'm appearing today as a constituent of Senator Case. And I'm grateful for everyone's service, and I am particularly grateful for the conversation of the last half hour, which shows to me the compassion of a Wyoming citizen legislator.
Now we lost you.
What have you lost?
We just the last 10 seconds. We heard the first part.
Well, I was going to reveal everything. Can you hear me now, Mr.
Yep. Keep going.
And to be able to participate in the reopening, if you will, of public involvement in a more, in a socially distanced way, but a closer way, is, I think, incredibly gratifying. And I'm very happy to be here and to share this time with you. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Any other public comment? Seeing none for the day, we'll see you all tomorrow morning, committee, at 8:30. Okay. And again, a big thank you to LSO for all of the work today.